Mary Baroff, continuing on tape number 3.
Is it on?
Yes.
And I served as an interviewer and sat on the admissions committee until there were plenty of faculty people to take over. The theory among nursing and education people was that only a nurse could qualify a nurse. And I obviously was not a nurse, and they felt that was better.
Did you serve with the Shapiro School as a volunteer?
Oh, yes.
As a volunteer.
Then George Stutz was the first president, and a very, very good president. I succeeded him, and I've forgotten what the term was, maybe 3 years. Maybe. I also helped write the Constitution, I think, for the school. The school really was a very, very good school, very good. We had definitely the pick of the students because we were so attractive. We had students from outstate because we had dormitory rooms. And we had very, very good staff, very good staff. Good cooperation from the people in the hospital with whom the students had to work. No Shapiro School student has ever flunked her state boards to become a licensed practical nurse.
Ever?
And the Shapiro School has headed the list of qualified students in the state of Michigan year after year after year. Now, as far as I know, this was true the last time I saw someone. I have not been to a board meeting in many, many years, first because of my illness, and secondly, because I really think that there is no need ever for a past president to hang around forever. She gets to be not very useful.
But you were there in the beginning.
I was then on the board of the hospital, which was the custom for the Shapiro School president to be an honorary member of the board. And then when I resigned as president, when my term was finished, I was kept on the board of the hospital for a year. Again, that was customary. And I found that a very enlightening experience. I was enormously impressed with the amount of work the men volunteers did. Nate Shapiro was head of the building committee, worked terribly hard, terribly, terribly hard. There were 2 or 3 other men who were president while I was there who put in endless time. They were a dedicated crew. My own husband had been on the board up until his illness and died in the Sinai Hospital.
So that your association with Sinai has been a long and
well, if you count North End Clinic, it's been a very long.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Oh, I know one of the North End Clinic volunteers that I wanted to tell you about.
Yes.
Was Mrs. Albert Wiseman, and I will have to check that. She eventually got a paid job, but she was on that's how she started as a North End volunteer. You asked me, I think at one time when we talked the other day,
yes,
about some of the volunteers,
yes,
and I think she was one that I put down.
Now, I would like, if you don't mind, now to talk with you a little bit about your association with the Jewish Community Council.
Oh, well,
for what purpose was the council formed? Do you know?
Oh, the council was, I can remember when it was formed. Cy Schetzer was one of the most brilliant, lovable, beautiful people that any of us have ever known. He, I think, was the founder. It was felt that...
When was it, by the way?
Oh, years ago. I have no idea.
Okay.
It was felt that the Yiddish-speaking part of the community was not represented in many of our activities, and that we didn't all get together. And the Jewish Community Council was formed to represent the entire community in a non-fundraising way. So we could discuss issues and problems affecting the Jewish community. And they came on the basis of membership, each with a certain number of delegates, I think. And for years, many of the speeches were made in Yiddish. My husband used to go faithfully as a member and was not really knowing what was going on. And I had nothing to do with the council at all for a long time until I went on to the Mayor's Interracial Committee. I think I told you I'd been on that. The council at that time felt that they should, I think, have been asked to suggest the Jew. They suggested that there was no Jew on the Mayor's Interracial Committee, nor was there a woman. And I think the council felt that since they had suggested they were a Jew, there should be a Jew, they should have been asked whom they would suggest. Well, they did not suggest me. The women suggested me, and I was both. And we did some few things, the commission and the council together. The work with what we called then the Negro community was entirely the work of the commission. The commission, the Jewish Community Council, had some programs, I think, occasionally that took in anti-Semitic feelings and so forth. I think the main reason for the council, at one time, was to combat anti-Semitism and to bring under one umbrella all the different defense agencies. They were all carrying on their own program. The Jewish War Veterans, the Jewish Labor Committee, the Jewish B'nai B'rith committees, the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee. And the council more or less brought them under one umbrella. And their purpose at one time, and I don't know when this was actually said, was to see to it that 100 people didn't write a letter protesting something when the council could speak for the whole community and speak officially.
So that, in other words, it really had two major purposes. One, to bring together elements in the community that didn't have a voice.
Yes.
And also a defense, to bring together those groups that were,
And I had no activity with them at all until after I resigned from the commission. Right. At which time they asked me if I would be chairman of what they called their Urban Affairs Committee. They then were feeling very strongly, this was after the riots, that there should be some participation on the part of the council in the black problem in Detroit.
I see. And did you chair that committee?
I chaired that committee, and Walter Klein made the best, and I think the most constructive suggestion, and we carried it out, that particular committee ever did. He suggested that we give scholarship fund a very substantial amount, and I can't tell you what it was now, for a given number of black students to be assisted for preparing themselves for college. The black community had organized what they called a Higher Education Opportunity Committee, HEOC. They selected hopeful students in the 12th grade who had no money and no idea in the world that they would ever get to college. And this committee raised funds largely among the blacks to begin with, not in the end, but to begin with. It was chaired by Wade McCree, a circuit court judge, and now a judge of the appeals court. And Walter suggested that we give a very substantial contribution to them, and we offer the services of our agencies for these students if they needed assistance. They could go for vocational counseling to our vocational counselors. They could go to the clinic for certain kinds of help. They could go to the Jewish Family Agency if they had problems with their families. How useful any of that was, I really don't know. The actual money put students through. There's no question about that. And we were quite explicit that our students would not be known as the Jewish students. Mm-hmm. They were just nobody knew who they were. They were like anybody else. The money to finance them was gotten by the Urban Affairs Committee from a fund, United Jewish Charities Fund, I think they call it, which was for experimental and special projects not included in the budget. And it was not renewed when we asked for it the next year. It caused not a good deal, but some criticism. Why should we be helping black kids when Jewish kids needed help? I think it was a very worthwhile gesture.
Does that committee still exist in the council structure?
Yes, I think it does. I went from that committee onto the executive committee. The guy who's now president, cut it off. Was the chairman of the committee after I was, I think. And it was a really fairly representative committee. There were loads of people on it from whom I'd never seen before and who came from various walks of life. There were a couple of rabbis. They were part of another interracial thing that I can't tell you the name of anymore, and I think maybe still be in existence. We were part of what they called Project Equality that the Catholic Church had started, in which you pledged yourself not to deal with organizations that were not equal opportunity organizations. And we were part of that.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
How, one of the reasons that the council was formed was to give representation to various segments of the community. How does it, how is its voice heard, or how does
Well, its voice is heard. They have a delegate assembly, I think 4 times a year. And they write letters to congressmen or to the mayor, or they speak to the police department. They take some part in civic activities. They take a much larger part, I think, in Jewish activities. The whole matter of arbitration between problems within the Jewish community comes normally to one of their committees.
And an arbitration committee?
Yes, which is an old institution and which is very sensible. And you don't wash your dirty linen in public. And
is it used as much today
as it
was in the past?
I never was on that committee. And Matilda Rubin was in charge of another committee that was very active, internal affairs, I think they called it. Then they were active with the youth groups. They were very eager to get young people in. It's 4 years since I have been there. I resigned when I was having trouble with my hip.
But you were honored by the council, I know.
No, the Jewish Community Council didn't honor me. I was honored by the Coordinating Council for Human Affairs,
Oh.
which was a branch of the commission. That was an organization made up of a great many agencies, black, white, every religion, who were working with problems of prejudice of any kind. And they gave a Human Rights Day dinner, at which for years they honored somebody. And I, one year, presented the award to the honoree, and the next year was given the same award.
I see. That was my error, Mrs. Krolik.
Yes.
I was referring to the honor that was paid you by the American Jewish Committee, and that was approximately 3 years ago.
Yes, and I was very proud and very touched.
Right. What was now? Was it for a specific?
No, I think it was for my work generally.
In general.
I remember saying at the time that the only reason I was getting it, rather than a dozen or 24 other people in the room with whom I'd worked and who deserved it just as much, was because I was that much older. And I had had a chance.
You're too modest.
I had had a chance to work a much longer time than the rest of them.
Now, I think that I would like now, if we could, to talk a little bit about your experience and knowledge of Julian Krolik and Fred Butzel, because you can give us some insights that perhaps the community doesn't have.
I don't think I know anything that they don't know, but I know it better.
Yeah, right, okay. And some of the details also.
Well, I was thinking, before you came, why those two men could do all the things they did. Julian, the Federation has constantly been accused of being non-democratic. That only a handful of people run everything. And Julian explained it this way. He said, really the only people who have time to be volunteers are the people that are fairly independent. I never take a lunch hour. So when I go off for an hour and a half to a luncheon meeting, my partners have no kick coming because I'm taking what they take every day. And they're quite willing to have me do it. But I am independent. But the clerk that has to punch a clock can't do that. So that person is not on such and such a committee. And most volunteer jobs have to be done by somebody who either has someone at home to do what she would have been doing, or he would have been doing, or a willing family to carry over for them. You have to, so it can't be democratic. It has to be the people whose time is somewhat flexible. And this is hard to make a democratic organization that way. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes, I do understand.
Does that sound reasonable?
Yes, yes.
The reason I could run around.
And also because, and another factor that probably enters in is that as people become very experienced, their experience becomes invaluable.
Well, that isn't always true. I think you can be used over and over again, but you have to be free
to give your
to
time.
run around.
Right. Tell me this.
Also, you have to be able to afford it. You have to be able to afford the parking. You have to be able to afford decent clothes to go and preside at a meeting. And it isn't that there aren't a lot of organizations that are run by a group of people who can't afford it. They run it their own way, and they run it at their convenient hours. But the big overall organizations, I don't know if this is making sense, but I've been trying to think it out, that the big overall organizations have to be run by people who are a little bit free and have a little bit more time and a little bit, maybe not have enough money to get around. And Fred had all of that. Fred had no responsibility in the whole wide world to anybody. His law partners accepted immediately the fact that he was going to spend all his life in public affairs. He had no children. He had no wife. He had no children. He was a devoted son, but that didn't last forever. And Fred gave his whole life, without any question, to service to the public.
How long did you know him?
Well, he was one of my father's good friends, and then he was one of Julian's good friends. He and Julian, I think, started the first English class over at the Hannah Schloss Building, somewhere in the 1900s. I suppose they were both just out of college, something like that.
I mean, for immigrants?
Yes. And Fred also had a real gift, way ahead of his time, of using women. He treated women exactly the way he treated men. He expected just as much of them. He put them in just as important jobs. He was just as cross with them, if he wanted, as critical if he had to be. But he treated them absolutely as equals, which was way, way ahead of his time.
Right. He would be honored by the groups who are interested today.
And Julian, the word that people use to describe Julian always, and everybody described him this way, was fair. And he was fair. He would grant your point and attempt to meet it fairly, realizing frequently that it couldn't be met. But he would do the best he could about it, and he would give you every chance to make your point. Over and over again, people have used that word to me, talking about Julian, that he was fair. Both Fred and Julian were deeply concerned about injustices and would like to have remedied them. They were both very good Jews. They believed in Jewish principles. They were observing Jews and Reform Jews, both of them, but observing Reform Jews. And they were also third or fourth generation Americans.
Both of them.
Yeah, Fred, I don't know how far back Fred's family goes, and Julian's goes way back. Julian's mother, well, I suppose to almost the Civil War or something like that. So that's a long time.
Were their backgrounds both German?
Yes.
Yes.
And that's why during the war they were both so deeply involved. Julian brought in over, I think, 21 people, and Fred was up to his ears. I don't say that's, well, they were deeply involved with anything Jewish, but it was Germany that they hated most. And both were men with a very good sense of humor. Fred was completely unorthodox. If Fred wanted to get a job for a refugee or wanted to get some money for somebody somewhere, he had a way of wangling the situation. He was very I don't know if I mean ingenuous or ingenious. Ingenious, I think, ingenious. He would invent ways. We always were fascinated the way our refugees were protected by Fred's schemes. They could stay another 6 months or something of that sort.
He was very, he helped a great many people. I'm talking about Fred, first about Fred Butzel.
Yes.
He helped a great many people personally, did
He
he
gave
not?
scholarships to loads of people. Heaven only knows how many.
Yes,
And how many never
students.
paid back.
Mhm.
To students all the time. And he was consulted by all kinds of people all over the community, not by Jews necessarily. He and Tracy McGregor were very good friends. Tracy McGregor had married a very rich woman who left him a very large fortune, which he in turn left to the McGregor Fund, which is still in existence, I think, a little bit. And people like Mrs. Edsel Ford and Mrs. Kanzler would come to Fred for advice on work that they were doing or donations they were making.
In their community work.
Yes, in the community. Fred and Julian were very active in the community chest. Both were, I think both were vice presidents at some time. And very active workers, not only in the Allied Jewish campaign, but in the community fund campaigns. And both were very good solicitors. Julian was an excellent solicitor.
So they had many similarities, but also...
Yes, but Fred had no awareness of family ties as Julian did. He could move freely.
What were his strongest interests?
Oh, music.
Music.
He loved music. He was a very poor pianist. That had nothing to do with it. But he knew a great deal about music. He used to have Sunday morning double quartets. Two pianos playing double duets. He would play one hand, and then all kinds of people were invited, and it was quite an honor to play the other three. He also would come to a group of us young people before any opera came to Detroit. That's when there were traveling opera companies. And he would discuss with us at great length the various motifs, and he'd play them on the piano, and he'd tell us the themes. And I think it was really good for us. It made me aware. I don't happen to like opera at all. My father adored it, which is why he wanted us to have that. But it taught us a lot of things. As a matter of fact, when Julian and I were married, Fred gave us a piano. This is what I wanted more than anything else. And I hadn't been able to afford it before. And I was delighted to have one.
Yes. Do you know how he became involved in community affairs originally?
I think it was just part of the German Jewish philosophy that the rich Jews, he was a Butzel, and his brother Martin Butzel, his Magnus Butzel, his father, Magnus Butzel was who was Fred's father? I'll think of it. And there were the two Butzel families, and they were both rich families. I don't know what they made their money in, I haven't any idea. And it was their duty to take care. That's the Jewish way of life, of poor Jews. They were leaders. And I don't think it would ever have occurred to Fred that it wasn't his duty. Leo Butzel, who was Magnus Butzel's son, was the first chairman here in Detroit of the American Jewish Committee. And he was not nearly as Jewishly minded as Fred was, but it was, again, that was an obligation. And his son, Martin Butzel, was about to be president of Temple Beth, when he became ill, and they've been active in various activities ever since.
What do you think were Fred Butzel's major contributions to the community?
It's hard to estimate them because they were so far flung. He, I think, was the founder of the Boys' Republic, where they had and every Saturday afternoon he went out to court, where they held court. The boys held their own court and made their own decisions. That was much better than any kind of a reform school. That was unorthodox. The boys went to public school, but they came back to live at the Republic at night. And I think the man that taught the manual training at the Hannah Schloss Building originally, Homer T. Lane, was the first director out there. And there was known as a Homer T. Lane Club that some of those young men belonged to. There was another club that Abe Schwery, maybe the Hannah Schloss Building, Hannah Schloss Old Timers Club, that Abe Schwery and Gus Newman and George Stutz, a lot of those boys, men, belonged to. Someone else can tell you more about that. George can tell you more about that. George Stutz.
Yes, yes.
But Fred was a leader. He was a born leader, and he was utterly fearless. He didn't give a hoot what anybody thought about him, nor did he care if he hurt your feelings. He went ahead and did what he knew had to be done, and did it.
And he involved himself in many communities.
All over the city.
All over the city.
In everything. Twice, he could be very generous, too, when he wanted to. Very generous. Oh, he was very generous. Twice I saw him in two peculiar situations. And I've been trying to identify in my mind what the first one was, or what the names of them were. We were at some kind, I suppose, an annual meeting, maybe a federation. And 2 or 3 people chose not to accept the report of the nominating committee and asked if they might make nominations from the floor, which was permitted. And somebody was nominated and said he really didn't want it. And finally it was left with only one person nominated. And Fred said, I think it would be simplest if I withdraw from the board and we accept this nomination. What happened, I have never known. I don't remember whether the man was shamed into withdrawing, and maybe there was no reason why he should be ashamed, or whether Fred was made an ex officio member, I don't know. But that was a very gracious gesture on Fred's part. Then there was some kind of a deal on, we met at the Temple Beth, I remember, to have an international Jewish Congress. And all the organizations met to nominate delegates. And again, Fred was defeated. And again, Fred accepted the defeat because there were so many, actually, there were so many more people who didn't know Fred by this time from all over the city than did. And he was sent finally as a special delegate from Federation, and then the Congress never was held. But he was never greedy about honors, and I don't know that he ever got any. Oh, the Fred M. Butzel Award, which was invented after his death as a tribute, was never given to him, of course.
But in other words, his leadership abilities and his strength
yes.
were really had a very great impact on the direction that many agencies
Oh, there's
took.
no question about it. Anybody who didn't know what to do went and asked Fred. Incidentally, Julian was the first person to receive the Fred M. Butzel Award. which I thought was particularly
Yes.
appropriate.
Yes, especially since they were such
Yes,
dear friends.
and it was a very good thing to have done.
Tell me, well, okay, is there anything else that we should
Fred-
talk about?
Fred was what a leader is. There is no question about it, that he was we've never had anybody in the community that spoke for the community and to the community the way he did. There's never been anyone like him. There really hasn't. Dora Ehrlich was as near that as anyone else that I know. And Dora was a woman, and her interests were somewhat more limited. But Fred really was adored, not adored, but was admired and listened to by everybody. Until, I think I told you this story, as the world got bigger and bigger, when I became interested in democratic politics, someone suggested various people for something, and I said, I'm sorry, I don't know them. And my friend said to me, you don't realize that there are other people in this town beside the Butzels and the Kroliks.
Now, can we talk about Mr. Krolik a little bit?
Well, Julian was good. This is the two words people always used about Julian was fair. He was always taking care of everybody. When any family was in any kind of, his friends, any kind of problem, in any kind of trouble, Julian went over and took care. A woman would lose her husband, a good friend of his. He would go over and take care of the funeral arrangements. He babysat with us when my mother died at the time of her funeral. Of course, this I have no memory of. But he was a big boy, and I was a little girl. He did all kinds of things for everybody. He picked up every board member that had to go to every evening meeting. I never had been on any board where anybody else did that, or even offered to give me a ride. Julian ran the North End Clinic, was president for 7 years, and he took the whole board, wandered all over the town, picking up the ladies, and was devoted, always had time for their problems. I think I told you, the only time I was on the board of the North End Clinic, I heard nothing about anything but the boiler. And I think you'll read in that book that Mr. Neiman cherished the boiler as though it was his own. There are no words to tell you about Julian except that he was good, and my friends who knew him from my job felt he was very courtly. He had beautiful manners, which I suppose not too many people have anymore. But he had the good manners because he felt them inside. And he was a very good and devoted father. For years, he came home to dinner every night to be with his son, and would not go out to a meeting until after Henry was maybe in bed or something of that sort. He was a devoted father. He was a devoted father to my children, and he was perfectly wonderful and very resourceful with all our refugee families. Got jobs for them, and the amount of work he did for them. When we read his files afterwards, pages and all the letters to the State Department, all the letters to the banks, all the letters for jobs, all over the place. He wanted to help people.
He was a true humanitarian.
Oh, he was.
Yes.
There's no question. I can't say any wrong things about Julian. Most people have some faults, and I suppose Julian did. The children said, no stories before the turn of the century, that he always repeated his stories, and that was their
limit.
Their limit. But I have nothing to say about Julian except that he was good and he made us very happy.
Let me ask you this, in relationship to his role in the community, he became involved at a very young age, did he not?
Well, as I say, he was, in the beginning, I think maybe I didn't tell you this, he ran around and collected the dues for the Frauenverein. The Frauenverein was the Ladies and Widows Orphan Society, only they called it the Frauenverein because they were all German ladies. Did I tell you this story?
No, I believe not.
This is one of our family legends. And Julian went around for his mother, who was a member, and collected the dues. His mother was elected secretary, and when my mother came to town, his mother and my mother became bosom friends, and my mother was elected to the board. And his mother could not write German. She had been born in Richmond, Virginia. So she made a motion that the minutes be written hereafter in English. And my mother seconded the motion. And the chairman, Mrs. Heinemann, who was very indignant, said the meeting is adjourned. No, went on to another matter. And my mother, who was a new little upstart, said, Madam Chairman, a motion is on the floor and has been seconded. And Mrs. Heinemann said, the meeting is adjourned. And no Heinemann ever spoke to a little Ginsburg again.
Is that right?
We used to go over and play with the grandchildren when they came over. Never again. And then I think the Frauenverein became dissolved and became part of the United Jewish Charities.
But in other words, this was Julian Krolik's first volunteer job.
To pick up the and then in college, I'm sure he did things, but I don't know what. He was a member of the Deutscher Verein, I remember, in college. Why? And that had nothing to do with this. And then he and Fred had these English classes. And as I say, he was a big boy, and I was a little girl, and there was 7 years difference in our ages, and that made a difference when you're in high school and so forth. And so I can't tell you what else he was doing all that time.
But his role...
But he was always on boards. The minute I knew him, really knew him as a grown-up person, he was on every board in town.
Yeah, he was on the North End Clinic Board.
Well,
for
before
years,
he was
right?
president of that for 7 years, and he was on the board of the Jewish, whatever they called it, Jewish Social Service Bureau. Was on that for a long time, and he must have been on a couple of other boards. He was on the United Jewish Charities board. He was president of the United Jewish Charities at one time.
What do you think were his major contributions to the community?
Well, I can't tell you. I really have no idea. He was a leader, and he spoke for all of us, and we trusted him as a community. I don't know anybody who didn't like Julian and who didn't trust him. They may not have agreed with him, and they may have thought he was a bore, or things like that. And he was known for falling asleep in the best living rooms in Detroit. But he was trusted by everybody.
He had tremendous integrity, did he not?
Oh, absolute integrity. There is no such thing as absolute integrity. Either you have integrity or you don't have it. He was not expedient. No, he was thoroughly honest. He lived through all kinds of business hardships. The business, incidentally, the Krolik business, is over 100 years old here in Detroit, surviving today. Jean Krolik's, whom you just met, husband is president.
Was her husband Day Krolik?
Yes,
Oh, I see.
Day Jr.
Yes. Yes.
And their son is Day Third.
So the Krolik family has made its impact in the city of Detroit in many, many
Oh,
ways.
yes. Well, Grandma Krolik, Mrs. Sarah Krolik, Henry Krolik's mother, a wife, started the self-help circle because she believed that she was not a Jewess. Well, there's the mail. She believed that these Jewish women had to be able to adapt to American ways, and they should learn to cook and to sew. And she had classes, and she invited young women to come and be trained as teachers for these women. Didn't I tell you this, how I flunked my sewing?
Yes.
And incidentally, Ricky, another one of the Kroliks, has several of the sewing books for you, for Barbara. She will give them to Barbara.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. Mrs. Krolik, I want to thank you very much for all the information that you furnished that'll help us gain some real historical insights and perspectives about our organized Jewish community. I could not really end these talks with you without pointing out that in discussing with you your activities and involvements with the Jewish community, we are covering only one facet of your involvements and contributions because you've been so active and committed to the larger metropolitan Detroit community. You have served in many capacities. For example, your activities with UCS, with the Detroit Commission on Community Relations, with the NAACP, with nursing, and with helping inner-city young people make the grade in that field. And I'm sure that I've only just begun to touch the surface. Your activities in the general community are no accident. They are indeed a part of your philosophy of community service, are they not?
Yes, I believe very strongly that, as I think I told you in the very beginning, that the very first thing I told you about was how I was brought up in the middle of Catholics. And it never entered my head that we didn't all work for each other. And in view of the fact that I had no way of escaping being a volunteer, being my father's daughter, that I was a volunteer somewhere else. When I was, it was a great surprise to me and one I couldn't possibly refuse. And it was a wonderful opportunity. And I think I may have told you why I was on the commission so long, that each mayor couldn't find a good enough excuse to fire me. And there were times when I remained on purposely, so there would be some continuity when there was no other continuity. For example, when George Shermer left suddenly to go to Philadelphia, I felt I, as a senior person, ought to stick around till we got a new man to run it. And I was on the committee that chose the new man, incidentally. And I was not on, they did not choose the new man that I wanted. The mayor finally appointed whom he wanted. But I had the feeling then, which I still have right this minute, that I had an obligation to my community, that I was an American, which was to me the greatest privilege that anyone can have. I'm sure every Englishman thinks the same thing, and every Spaniard and so forth, but I happen to think being an American is a tremendous privilege. I am a perfectly loyal Jew, and the two things together put you in two different fields frequently.
Well, I think the community is very fortunate, both the Jewish community and the general community, to have had your loyalties.
Well, I think any community needs a certain amount of volunteer help. There just aren't enough people to go around. There's enough money to pay enough people to go around. And volunteer help is very rewarding. It is much more rewarding to you frequently than it is to the people who have to accept it, who would much rather you weren't there often, and frequently are very grateful to you. But you do what you can, you fight injustice wherever you find it, and because it's black or white or Chinese or something else, you do within your own limits what you can do.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Krolik.
I thank you.